much to the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this dialogue. I am Professor of Humanities at Duke Kunshan University, which is a joint venture of Duke University in the United States and Wuhan University in China, and I'm director of our Humanities Research Center. Our center sponsors cross-cultural and interdisciplinary research in the humanities and social sciences. And indeed, our entire university functions as a continuous dialogue between civilizations on global commons. I invite you to visit our university and very happy to welcome any of you who are able to visit China. We have many students from Italy in our university, and I'm very interested in supporting the strong relations between Italy and China in the area of these kinds of global dialogues. And I'd also like to recognize the presence of two of our students sitting behind me, Suyu Wang and Qianyu Zhang. From my experience as an educator, it's always vital to include the future generations in the dialogues that we have. Since the previous millennium, I've been involved in dialogues across civilizations in the United States and China, first at Harvard University, which held a series of conferences on world religions and ecology, culminating with a major conference at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This work helped to spawn the academic discipline of religion and ecology, which is my major research and teaching area. And this has supported and encouraged the efforts of religious leaders across the world to re-examine their own religious traditions with a view to foregrounding ecological issues. And of course, Pope Francis has been the most important proponent of this religious engagement with ecological ethics. Probably I'm one of the very few, perhaps even the only professor in China who has the privilege of teaching Laudato Si to students in China. As I mentioned yesterday, China is a country of rich religious diversity, and to understand China requires a complex investigation of its major civilizational traditions. And I'd like to do so briefly today through an investigation of traditional Taoist precepts, rules for the governance of communities. Typically, such precepts indicate ways that members of the community should restrain themselves from excessive behavior or the temptation to overact. They are essentially precautionary principles, seeking to restrain human beings from behavior that is in some way detrimental to their own well-being. And I think this is relevant for the Sustainable Development Goals 12 to 15 that are indicated in this element of the program. Consumption and production nowadays are not simply economic issues, but also moral issues. That is, the concept of responsible consumption and responsible production implies that we have a responsibility to other people regarding the nature of our consumption and production. And in our current epoch of the Anthropocene, we realize that life on land, life below water, and climate change are deeply influenced by human actions. This suggests that our responsibility is not simply to ourselves or even to our children, but to the planet itself. But how can we fulfill this planetary responsibility? The answer lies in recognizing the limits to the capacity of our planet to produce and exercising certain degrees of restraint. And this is what we see in the Paris Accords. The problem, of course, as has been noted, is that our fundamental worldview of modernity is predicated on the illusion of an infinite progress, an infinite economic development, a kind of infinite freedom and infinite technological development. This illusion of infinity must be replaced by the realities of our finitude. The leadership of governments, presidents, and world leaders is necessary but it's an insufficient condition for the transformation of our broad cultural worldviews that is necessary to implement and inhabit this kind of transformation. This is something that must happen to the world's populations and cultures. But what resources do we have within our own cultural traditions to guide us in this way? Personally, I'm focused on the role that religions can play in this task. And although the world's religions were formed in an axial age which focused human minds on questions that are perhaps quite different from the challenges that we face today, at the same time, the successful religions of the world are ones that have thrived and adapted to changing historical, political, and intellectual contexts. Now, in the Taoist tradition, we can look to the collections of texts focused on precepts whose overall aim is to guard against certain kinds of actions. And this slightly negative idea, perhaps it sounds a little bit negative. There are certain kinds of things that you shouldn't do or you shouldn't do too much of. But the overall goal of this is set within an ethic that we can simply describe as flourishing. The goal of the self, the individual, and also the community is to help bring about the flourishing, the maximal possible opportunities and growth for the community as a whole. And this cannot be achieved by any individual on their own. This is something that occurs naturally within the flourishing of things within the natural environment. And very early on, the Taoist tradition developed what we might anachronistically refer to as environmental ethics, admonitions against polluting wells, lighting fires, drying up wetlands, and so forth. Why did the Taoist tradition develop these rules and regulations? The overall idea is that if we do not exercise certain kinds of restraints, in the end, this will come to harm us. There will be some consequence for our own livelihood and well-being if we are not cautious in some areas. One of the moral problems that human beings face is that sometimes we are incapable of properly exercising restraint. The result is violence, war, and destruction. These are problems, and these precepts may be understood as a documentation of what Taoists saw as the fundamental problems in the world that are occasioned by the lack of human restraint. And my interpretation of these is that all of these issues derive from what Taoists understood as the porous connection between the body and the world. That is to say, we human beings live in contexts that permeate our own bodies, and our bodies involve and inform the world outside. That is, we live in a kind of permeable or porous context in which what happens outside of the world is also something that happens to us in our own bodies and our own lives. What can we learn from this for making responsible decisions in a world that is increasingly felt as insisting its way into human bodies, social worlds, and built environments? Can these precepts give some guidance for a world of pandemics and climate instability? I think what we're coming to learn through the pandemic, and also through the development of environmental and logical sciences, is a truth that is hard to grasp intuitively, but one that I think has been widely recognized within the Taoist tradition, that we're not, in fact, prisoners facing a dilemma, to use the example cited earlier, but beings with porous borders, already interpenetrated by others and by context. The migrant crisis that is playing out in Europe and on the southern border of the United States is already happening in our own bodies. Right? We may suppose that our bodies and our health are immune to the effects of climate change, but they're not. Our bodies are just as porous as our borders, and this porosity is not a problem to be solved, but a condition for the possibility of exercising virtue. One salient feature of the Taoist framework is that the model of what is good must be produced at the level of the health and well-being of the various bodies involved. The goal is the maximization of flourishing, that is the context in which our lives and livelihoods can take place. Just one thing then, the environment is not something outside of us, right? The environment is something inside of us. It insists within our bodies, and this relation, this ecological understanding of the world around us in relation to our own health and livelihood, this is the foundational principle for how we should act in the world. We're not acting in something out there. We're doing something that is already involves and implicates ourselves and our health. Thank you very much.